I was watching something there yesterday. I think the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the States put out a master plan for ending mass surveillance. And one of the points, I think was one of the first points, was getting the tech companies to harden their approach to protecting data. The tech companies themselves, I mean, on one hand you can say, well look, the technology has evolved faster than we could have realized, and we're all carrying now computers in our pockets. But on the other hand, they're making money, vast amounts of money out of this infrastructure they've created. What kind of leadership positions should the tech companies take, or are they willing to, in your opinion?
I think that's a hard question, because to be fair, one problem they really have is they have to stick to different jurisdictions. So for example, in the US, they have to give out all this information under the law. Under European law, that's prohibited. The problem they have is that they try to get international companies take advantage of, I don't know, the tax regime here, access to the stock market in the US, and all these kind of different things, and now they're under a lot of jurisdictions that are actually in conflict. I think the overall problem here is something that not necessarily the tech companies can actually deal with. That's something that has to be solved politically. What they could do, however, is to change their systems in a more privacy-friendly way. For example, in Facebook, they keep all your deleted information, saying that it's a centralized database, and if person A deletes a message, if we're having a conversation, I delete my side of the message, they still need to keep the conversation to display to you. Now the problem is that they can still centrally get all my messages that I've ever written, and there's no way I can practically delete them. That's a systematic failure. That's something where if you have separated in and out boxes, if you have them spread out on the network in a way that you can't recover it anymore, which is the typical case for email. If I delete my inbox, they have to go after 100,000 other email providers to really get the information. These are things that you could possibly solve technically. There are also things that with encryption, if really the keys is only with the individual users, the company can say, we don't have the keys, I'm very sorry, you gotta get it from somewhere else. That's things that they can technically solve. Legally, that's really a thing that if they have access to the information and there's a legal procedure to get it, they have to give it out. What we were going after in the Facebook case was to exactly go after this difference in jurisdiction. So we sued Facebook Ireland for participating in the PRISM program by forwarding the data to Facebook US, and to get them into the trouble of these two sides. Because if we win the case by any means, you can totally see Silicon Valley line up at the White House and be like, we got a serious problem here. Because either we get rid of the tax regime over there, or we get rid of like the servers over here, and that's kind of really getting them into the position of solving this conflict. So far, this conflict was mainly solved by Europe not really applying the law.
When you look at what what Snowden had done by doing what he'd done, revealing all that information, you know, it's nearly possible to say in technology, nearly every second or third article you read these days has something about trust and privacy in it. And it was debated last week at Davos by, I think, Marissa Mayer and Salesforce.com's CEO, that they were talking about basically, you know, trust is going to be one of the most important things in the next while. Would you be optimistic that this issue will one day be resolved, or is it a long road ahead?
I don't think the trust issue is that big, because it would be necessary that the average guy on the street knows what's going on to mistrust. And that's the basic problem, that the average guy on the street just doesn't remotely understand what's going on. I have done a lot of cases that even the privacy freaks that come to kind of speeches I do, as soon as I show them the actual data sets from Facebook telling them that, I don't know, there's a category called last location where they exactly have your GPS coordinates, even though you've never shared anything with them, stuff like that. If you show that to them, they're outraged. And that's even the people that are concerned about privacy that come to a conference like that. And that is the, I think, underlying problem, that there is not that much mistrust as it would be necessary or would be reasonable, because just of a lack of understanding and knowledge. And that's one of the biggest problems in the whole privacy debate, is that you have a black box where all this is happening. It's some server in the US. You roughly know what's going in, you roughly know what's coming out. Sometimes they have mistakes, so you have a better understanding of what's going on. Sometimes you have people like Facebook that for internal communications problems shift you a bunch of data out of it, so you can get a rough idea of what's going on. This debate is too complicated to really get through on arguments, on really understanding everything. I usually compare it to the atomic power plant thing. No one of us understands how an atomic power plant works. We just roughly know, do I want to have that in front of my front yard or not? And we get kind of a rough idea of what the consequences can be. We had a couple of cases where things went wrong, and then you can have a debate in a way, and we make a decision. And unfortunately, we'll very likely end up in the same side on the privacy thing, that people just had cases like Snowden where they see, oh my God, that's the amount of data they have. In my case, it was this 1,200 pages, which all the media went after because it was like physical and tangible. And I think on this side, you can possibly get people shift and think about this. But the idea that people really fully understand what thousands of companies hold about them do in the background.
The words that are going through my head is playing with fire here, because you're gathering all this data, and ultimately it's still in the hands of human beings who make mistakes.
Yeah, or computers that make mistakes.
Exactly, and hardly a week goes by without some breach happening or some nefarious activities by a hacker, for example, breaks in, because that's what they do, they try to break in. The tech industry, does the moral hazard or the moral obligation then lie in the hands of the tech industry to try and figure out how can it do things better and more safer?
I think there are two things that are oftentimes mixed. The one thing is really data security, where you're usually in the boat with the industry because both don't want to have a breach. That's something where you usually don't have too much of a conflict between the company and the person. Of course, the people are outraged because company X didn't secure it well enough, but usually you're like on the same side. You want to have it secured. In a market-driven society, you do, as a big, especially US-based, with a cultural approach from their company, you try to make as much money as possible. That's your obligation, no matter what the laws are. And that was one key difference from a US perspective in my legal training, was we didn't talk about what's legal or not legal. We talked about how likely it is you're going to be uncovered, you're going to be persecuted, how much you're going to pay, and if that is cheaper than sticking to the law or breaking the law. That was the question. So it's a very business approach. And if the only consequence we have in Europe is a couple of $1,000 that you may pay, the answer is let's break the law and make money. And this is something that Europe has to understand and realize. And right now we're more in this whiny position, and people are like, but why aren't they sticking to our laws? Aren't they nice? Which is just totally like naive if you look at the realities out there.